What a great pleasure it is to be with you all for the third of 6 broadcasts on C.S. Lewis. We've covered a lot of ground in the first 2. We've talked about the central idea in Lewis, which is joy, a desire for heaven. We've had some biography of C.S. Lewis. I've read some of his poetry. And the last time, 2 weeks ago, we talked about 2 continuing bestsellers that brought C.S. Lewis fame. Screwtape Letters, which was praised as a masterpiece of satire, and is really valuable as almost a manual on the psychology of temptation from the devil's point of view, and The Great Mere Christianity, based on Lewis's BBC broadcasts during World War II, virtually a handbook of Christianity, but posed in such conversational clarity that it's almost impossible not to understand him. Both of these books dealt with the hazards of self-absorption. In the case of Screwtape, the devil was constantly trying to get the patient, one of us, to turn his attention away from God and to himself, especially to his feelings. In Mere Christianity, Lewis finally concentrates on disobedience and the sin of pride, which he says is the most dangerous because the most spiritual, by which he means it comes straight from hell. Well, tonight we're also going to look at 2 books, as briefly as it is necessary to do that deal with the endangered self, endangered both morally and spiritually. This self we have is fragile, it's vulnerable. The first of these books is The Abolition of Man. That's right, The Abolition of Man. Not an easy book, and in my judgment, too short. Lewis was a master of brevity. Here, I think he overdid it. The second book is The Glorious Perelandra. Not Paradise Lost, not Paradise Regained, but Paradise Retained. We'll learn that some myths are not entirely false. But first, The Abolition of Man, a book about the natural law, about the moral code, and about the dangers of its disregard. Lewis trained first and foremost to be a philosopher, and his first teaching job at Oxford was as a philosopher. He believed in those days not in God, but in something he called the absolute. And he wrote many versions of this book, both in his notes, as lectures, and then as essays. One particular of particular importance was on ethics. The book itself began as the Riddell Lectures, which he was invited to give at the University of Durham in 1943. It came out as a book here in 1947. In fact, The Abolition of Man is a diagnosis and a prophecy. When subjectivism is rampantly triumphant, when the imperial self has gone crazy and the moral code, natural law, has been not refuted, but seen through, we begin to innovate. First on nature. By the way, Lewis was environmentally alert long before the cant began. Then on animals. He was also a vehement anti-vivisectionist. And finally, we start to work on our favorite subject, the self, ourself, which we will condition, not just innovate with respect to the moral law, but condition the human being even unto extinction. Any eugenicist or harvester, so-called, of human fetal tissue should take note of this book. Do you know the name Peter Singer? Peter Singer is a vaunted, celebrated professor of ethics at Princeton University, no less, who has come out in favor of human infanticide. So when I say Lewis was prophetic, I mean it quite literally. There are 3 parts to the book. The first is called, strangely, Men Without Chests. What Lewis says is the following. The head is reason, the belly is appetite. But in the Middle Ages, in between came the chest, which was the seat not only of sentiment, but of well-trained sentiment, responses to the world that were fitting. If that waterfall, he says, is sublime, then the ordinate or fitting response is awe. But these sentiments have to be trained so that the chest can mediate between the brain and the belly. The second part is called the way. Here, Lewis talks about the Tao. It's spelled T-A-O, but in fact it's pronounced the Tao, the way, the moral code. It's not a rubber band, and it's not a ruler that can be discarded when it's convenient. It is how we measure right and wrong. And this is the code that is preyed upon by the innovators. For example, one of the values that we esteem and treasure is equality. Our Lord Jesus died and rose today for all human beings. But equality is only one among a number of values. A second is freedom. What an innovator will do is rip that one value, equality, out of the fabric, out of the tapestry of the moral code, and elevate it to a height of prominence so that all of the others are subordinate to it. And we get something like the Soviet Union. Right? The third section in the book is called The Abolition of Man, and here we get right down to how man, human beings, are reduced to nothing more than nature. Not just internal organs, but atoms, molecules, complexes, Tourette syndrome, a bag of ticks, not tricks, but ticks. George MacDonald, Lewis's great 19th century mentor, has a poem about the rose and its fragrance. Oh, he says, certain scientists can take the rose apart to explain the scent of the rose. But why bother doing that if it destroys the scent? What we see, the phenomenon that we experience, is what matters. We can reduce man all we want, but really what happens is it gives some people power over other people. Conditioners like eugenicists or harvesters, you've heard this word, I'm sure, harvesters of human fetal tissue. Well, what is this way? I'll tell you what Lewis says it is. Christian morality is not new. Christian morality is the same morality we always had. And he shows in this book how it extends through all cultures at all times in all places. What will happen if man is abolished? Well, then, as I said previously, it'll just mean some men with power over others. Where does it start? It starts with calling into question the legitimacy of a fitting response. Lewis says, in a sort of ghastly simplicity, we remove the organ and demand the function. We make men without chests and expect of them virtue and enterprise. We laugh at honor and are shocked to find traitors in our midst. We castrate and yet bid the geldings be fruitful. He says later on, with respect to the Tao, stepping outside the Tao, trying to see through values the way some scientists try to see through the scent of the flower, is like stepping outside the Tao. Then they have stepped into the void. There is no such place where there are no values, if only power. Nor are their subjects necessarily unhappy men. We are not men at all. We become artifacts. Man's final conquest has proved to be the abolition of man himself. There is no easy summary to this book. The moral law is not a rubber band. We must be trained to feel properly. We cannot invent a new value. We may as well try to invent a new primary color. The conditioners are those who would try to invent a new value, but it all comes down to the power that they would consolidate for themselves. If you've read 1984, you know what Lewis is talking about here. And if man is a mere artifact, if we're just part of nature, not soul, not spirit, but just a random collection of atoms, purposeless, then we fail to exist, we cease to exist as human beings. We have to control the self, and we do that by respecting the independence, the objectivity of the moral code. That brings us to Perelandra, filled with dread, awe, glory, joy, pure excitement. At least that's what I'm filled with when I read, as I have many times, Perelandra. Lewis says it's really about a free person who, without manipulation by God, spontaneously carries out God's utmost desire. Here is a summary of the book that I wrote. See if it works with you as though you're hearing a myth. On the planet Perelandra, a beautiful paradise of water, floating islands, and fixed land, there dwelt a green lady and her king. Malaldil, maker of all things, gave them all they could want, but he forbade them ever to remain on the fixed land during night. The green lady and the king returned Malaldil's love and obeyed him. Then it happened that the lady and the king became separated. At that time, the dark power of earth, enemy of Malaldil and of all his creatures, came to the lady. In possession of another human who had surrendered himself to the dark power, he tried to persuade her to disobey Malaldil, and he might have succeeded had not Ransom, Malaldil's loyal servant from Earth, intervened. In spite of the danger to himself, and at the cost of great suffering, Ransom fought the dark power, called by Ransom the Unman, and drove him into the deep. And so it came to pass that the Green Lady and the King, because they had not disobeyed Malaldil, were raised to high glory as the father and mother of a new beginning. This book is the second of three that features Lewis's hero, Elwyn Ransom. The first is Out of the Silent Planet, and the second is That Hideous Strength, which is really a fictional depiction of what happens when the conditioners get control of human beings. Its origin, of course, is in Genesis, chapters 1 through 3. It began with a picture in Lewis's mind of floating islands, came out in 1943, and the reviews of the book were very, very, very favorable. In fact, one of them compared Lewis's achievement in this to Dante's achievement in his Commedia. That's quite praise. What we see in this book are many aspects of temptation, but we also see two things which are of the utmost importance. One has to do with what Lewis calls the voluble self, the talkative self, the person who is always trying to wiggle out of things. Now, poor Ransom, a middle-aged professor, a philologist of all things, finds himself on this planet facing the Unman, who has the power of Satan behind him. What does he have to do? Nothing more nor less than defeat Satan himself in the person of this Unman and save the planet. Oh, but this is nonsense, said the voluble self. He, Ransom, with his ridiculous body and his 10 times defeated arguments, what sort of miracle was that? His mind darted hopefully down a side alley that seemed to promise escape. Very well, then, he said to himself, he had been brought here miraculously. He was in God's hands as long as he did his best. And he had done his best. God would see to the final issue. He had not succeeded, but he had done his best. As for the fate of Venus, that could not really rest upon his shoulders. It was in God's hands. One must be content to leave it there. One must have faith. It snapped like a violin string. Ransom recognizes that it's all utter nonsense. It is up to him to fight the Unman. He hears a voice, and that voice says, "It is not for nothing that you are named Ransom. I, too, was Ransom." And, of course, that's the voice of Jesus reminding Ransom that he was sacrificed for the whole of our race, for the whole of our species. So Ransom decides that he must take matters to an extreme. What does he do? Well, he's argued, and we've made this point before. Lewis was a great debater. He was a wonderful poet. He was a great apologist who could wind arguments up and down hill and dale. But there comes a point when Lewis knows talk will not do. The voluble self has to be quiet. You remember the poem I read, the Apologist's Evening Prayer? Lord of the narrow gate and needle's eye, take from me all my trumpery lest I die. So, what Ransom decides to do, since he is losing the debate, is reason as follows. I did debate, and the Green Lady, though she's weakening, has held out. But that's no guarantee she will hold out forever. So, as incredible as it seems, as impossible as it will be to accomplish, I must engage in physical combat with this horrid creature, with drooling long teeth and horrible long nails. He does this, bleeding and trembling with weariness as he was, writes Lewis. He felt that nothing was beyond his power. He flung himself on the living death. His hands taught him terrible things. He felt its ribs break. He heard its jawbone crack. His own pains, where it tore him, somehow failed to matter. He felt that he could so fight, so hate with a perfect hatred for a whole year. The idea that something which had once been of his own kind and fed at a human breast might even now be imprisoned in the thing he was pursuing redoubled his hatred, and was unlike nearly all the other hatreds he had ever known, for it increased his strength. And sure enough, the unman flees from Lewis. He defeats the unman and is blessed by witnessing the great dance. Some of you may know of St. Bonaventura, who talks about the ubiquitous center, the center that is every place. This is the lesson of the great dance, which Ransom, when he's recovering on Paralandra, having saved the planet, having retained paradise, experiences. In the plan of the great dance, plans without number interlock, and each movement, writes Lewis, becomes in its season the breaking into flower of the whole design to which all else has been directed. The small things by their smallness, and the great by their greatness, and all the patterns linked and looped together by the unions of kneeling with accepted love, become love. Blessed be he. And this goes on for quite a period of time. We might wonder, when are words insufficient? Must we make physical combat? Must we walk away? Must we finally lose our tempers? What happens when we're out of alibis? When we see ourselves as we really are? When we, as St. Ignatius says, have put ourselves in the presence of God who sees the real self? And what is the standing of myth? Can it not be considered that we today are living the greatest myth ever contrived? That our Lord himself has made this myth, we in his image, and the story as he wants it to be told? Well, Paralandra ends very happily. It's the end of rhetoric, the beginning of myth, and the depiction of glory. Next time, 2 weeks from tonight, we'll talk more about C.S. Lewis himself and his ideas generally in his essays, his sermons, and his lesser-known fiction. For the last 2 weeks, the 5th and 6th sessions, we'll talk about Narnia and the essence of Lewis. But now, I have a foreshadowing of that discussion of Narnia, a special treat for the day we're in. It comes from The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the first book, it's the first book Lewis wrote, of the Chronicles of Narnia. Lucy and Susan, seen Aslan killed and tied to the stone table, what we would think of as our Lord's crucifixion. His mane has been cut off, but dozens of mice come to chew away the ropes that bind him. Finally, Lucy and Susan walked to the eastern edge of the hill and looked down. The one big star had almost disappeared. The country all looked gray. Then at last they stood for a moment, looking out towards the sea. The red turned to gold along the line where the sea and the sky met, and very slowly up came the edge of the sun. At that moment they heard from behind them a loud noise, a great cracking, deafening noise, as if a giant had broken a giant's plate. "What's that?" said Lucy, clutching Susan's arm. I feel afraid to turn round," said Susan. "Something awful is happening." "Oh, they're doing something worse to him," said Lucy. "Come on." And she turned, pulling Susan round with her. The rising of the sun had made everything look so different. They turned around and saw that the stone table was broken into two pieces by a great crack that ran down it from end to end. And there was no Aslan. "Oh, oh," cried the two girls, rushing back to the table. "Oh, it's too bad," sobbed Lucy. "They might have left the body alone." "Who's done it?" cried Susan. "What does it mean? Is it more magic?" "Yes," said a great voice behind their backs. "It is more magic." They looked round. There, shining in the sunrise, larger than they had seen him before, shaking his mane, for it had apparently grown again, stood Aslan himself. "Oh, Aslan!" cried both the children, staring up at him, almost as much frightened as they were glad. "Aren't you dead then, dear Aslan?" said Lucy. "Not now," said Aslan. You're not, she could not bring herself to say ghost. Aslan stooped his golden head and licked her forehead. "Do I look it?" he said. "Oh, you're real. Oh, Aslan," cried Lucy, and both girls flung themselves upon him and covered him with kisses. So, we see, he is risen. He is risen in Narnia, and he is risen right here and right now, today and forevermore.